Ah, yes, this next one. It's titled The Conspiracy Destroying Beautiful Buildings. Another thing I've got for Christmas was a copy of His Majesty's book on architecture called A Vision for Britain. It was written back when he was still the Prince of Wales. And quite an interesting treatise. I will say I do not agree with His Majesty on a lot of things, but he and I are of one mind when it comes to architecture and the importance of preserving beautiful and traditional architecture across Europe, across the United States, across the Western world. It's sad to see so much of the new construction in urban centers of major cities around the world having devolved to nothing more than these brutalist steel and glass monstrosities. I mean, it was kind of jarring to be walking around the Tower of London and then look over to the financial district and see just these massive skyscrapers almost intruding upon a serene sort of image. Nor to see these sort of weird-looking mid-century buildings alongside Tower Bridge. It was just all a bit jarring. I mean, there is something to be said for like old meets new, and newer structures coexisting peacefully alongside more traditional structures. But I don't know. I see the point when I look at so many of the skyscrapers in London versus more traditional buildings, and I think just an incredible missed opportunity. But anyways, let's take a look at this one here.
Some people are trying to make the claim that an advanced ancient civilization built great utopian cities all over the world.
If you look at the World's Fair up there in the 1900s, there's some really weird around that.
Want to talk about the Chicago World Fair?
They said that they built it for the World Fair, but then after they just tore it all down.
72-year-old structure is being beaten to a pulp as 1,800-pound ball crashes against its ancient but sturdy walls of stone.
Have you looked into the Tartarian stuff at all?
I was watching a video today about it.
So it's suspected that it could have possibly been Tartaria.
That's super strange.
And while they sound totally paranoid, I do want to examine the real historical cover-up that these photos represent. So I enlisted the help of my favorite architectural conspiracy expert, Zach Martise, to help navigate this serious question about our cities and where they come from.
The QAnon of architecture.
Of course.
What?
So Tartarian theory.
Okay, everyone, please. In case you have not caught up by now and you're about maybe 4 or 5 years behind, QAnon was a psyop. It was not real. It was an intelligence agency psyop designed to lull at least one half of the country into complacency and letting the guard down, and even manipulating them into some of them even staying home on election day. So, I mean, automatically we need to set the table with that. But let's keep going.
Theory is the idea that thousands of years ago, a world-spanning, hyper-technologically advanced global empire spread throughout the entire world, disseminating basically all pre-modern types of architecture.
Wait a minute, let's go back here. Tartarian Empire refers to a group of pseudo-historical conspiracy theories, including ideas of a hidden past and mud floods, which originated as pseudo-scientific Russian nationalism. Oh yeah, I've already got a bad feeling about this. Tartary, or Tartaria, is the historical name for Central Asia and Siberia. Conspiracy theories assert that Tartary, or the Tartarian Empire, was a lost civilization with advanced technology and culture, ignores the well-documented history of Asia, which Tartary refers to. In the present day, the Tartary region covers a region spanning from central Afghanistan to northern Kazakhstan, as well as areas in present Mongolia, China, and the Russian Far East in Chinese Tartary. The theory of Great Tartaria is a suppressed, lost land of civilization originated in Russia, with aspects first appearing in Anatoly Fomenko's New Chronology in the mid-1970s and early 1980s, and then popularized by the racial occult theory of Nikolai Levashov. In Russian pseudoscience, known for its nationalism, Tartaria is... it's all rather blurred here. It's known as the real name for Russia, which was maliciously ignored in the West. Russian Geographical Society has debunked the whole theory as an extremist fantasy, and far from denying the existence of the term, has used the opportunity to share numerous maps of Tartary in its collection. Since about 2016, conspiracy theories about the supposed lost empire of Tartaria have gained popularity on the internet, divorced from its original Russian nationalist frame. Yeah, this almost sounds like a Russian or Tatar or Slavic version of We Was Kangs.
Basically all pre-modern types of architecture. So particularly with this image, which you see all over Tartarian theories, there's really kind of the grand, oversized scale. Some people believe that the Tartarian Empire was populated by giants, right? So that's why the doorway is just so big. That's why the promenade is so wide.
We can start by analyzing exactly what's going on.
No, there's plenty of old structures that had massive doors, and they did it either for utility purposes, for large crowds to enter in at once rather than single file, or yeah, just for grand scale, simply for its own sake. Big doors were basically like an old-time dick swinging contest.
This particular image, which everyone seems to be so up in arms about, is taken right here in Chicago in the South Side area known as Jackson.
Yeah, that's not even Russian architecture that you're looking at, or Tartarian, or whatever the fuck they want to call it. That's a picture of fairgrounds from the Chicago World's Fair
Park. This is what it looks like today.
That's sad.
Not quite as impressive as the photos promised. That's because this was taken during the Chicago World's Columbian Exposition, which captivated the Western world from May to October of 1893. The image focuses specifically on the administration building that's sitting in the background just behind the enormously beautiful Grand Basin. To the left is the agricultural building, which held exhibition spaces for agricultural-like displays. And on the right is the Manufacturers and Liberal Arts building, and it was used for manufacturing demonstrations and things like that.
Seriously, why? What the hell would compel the city of Chicago to destroy something so beautiful? That in and of itself seems so criminal.
This is just one single view from a full 690 acres of similarly impressive planning. Not only that, the expo brought together the most innovative technology of the time. Inventions like the Ferris wheel and the electrified street lamps, they fascinated
the zipper, the automatic dishwasher, Cracker Jack popcorn.
Victorian tourists who saw this for the very first time right here. But curiously, the buildings themselves presented a vision for the future that was made of buildings from the past, which I think is a little bit strange.
Well, it's not so strange. They call it retrofuturism for a reason. You're taking old concepts and sort of freshening them up a bit in a more futuristic setting.
We know about all this because documents and souvenirs survived until today. But sadly, none of the buildings have survived in their original state. Even though they look timeless and everlasting in photographs like the one we just looked at, they were part of a temporary spectacle, a fantasy city crafted to impress visitors who had only really known cities as dirty industrial centers of commerce. So while some of the technology that we have from this fair still lasts until today, none of the buildings do. One of the lesser-known innovations, though, presented here was the pneumatic paint sprayer. This allowed workers to quickly apply paint over large surfaces. Yeah, the White City, this nickname that it earned from all of its gleaming white structures, was only possible because of spray paint. Most people accept this explanation, and of course, the Tartarians, they question it. And I do have to say that I don't believe that these buildings were just here one day and then gone the next either.
No,
and in fact, I believe that the ghosts of these buildings, they're responsible for the exact kind of cover-up and the exact kind of destruction that we're worried about happening to the Tartarians. Today, the Tartaria subreddit has over 52,000 members, and Tartarian architecture has 14,000. And every time here the Columbian Exposition comes up, it's pretty much the same thing.
So for most Tartarians, research is being on the internet. It's finding imagery, stringing it together, putting it on YouTube, tossing it on Reddit. Yeah, it's kind of basically the process of any kind of internet-born conspiracy theory.
They argue that it makes no sense that something so beautiful and grand could be just thrown away. Debates flare over its $19 million price tag, which seems exorbitant for just a 6-month installation. That's almost $600 million today. But
yeah, you have to adjust for inflation. Once you do that, $600 million for constructing fairgrounds, that, especially something on that grand of a scale, yeah, that doesn't seem so far-fetched anymore.
Modern events like the Olympics, they cost billions of dollars. And the Columbian Exposition attracted over 27 million visitors, which is a...
Yeah, that's... doesn't surprise me. And, of course, look at the Olympics. They end up bankrupting any city that hosts them these days.
Staggering number for the time. Another point of contention is just how convincing that these buildings are at looking real. But I think that's due to the fact that they were made in a way that we just don't see that much of today.
Cast plaster over wood scaffold.
They're made of cast plaster hung over wood scaffolding. If they were permanent, they would have likely been built out of stone, like marble. Marble buildings are made like sculptures. Each piece is carved painstakingly by hand, and then each highly crafted piece is assembled into place. Unlike stone, plaster is light, and it's brittle, and it can be cast instead of carved. This allows for really intricate and repeatable designs at a fraction of the cost and the time that it takes to carve it. And that's why we see such elaborate, repetitious ornamentation everywhere in the exposition. Plaster has a totally different economy to it, where the more that you make actually makes it cheaper to do because a single mold can produce dozens and dozens of copies. You can buy a plaster version of priceless Michelangelo's David head right now on Amazon for $20. But at the heart of this, and the reason that we're talking about any of it, is because people feel a certain kind of loss when monumental buildings are demolished. That's what the Tartarian story helps everyone to make sense of. While facts provide clarity in contexts like this, they don't necessarily address how buildings capture our emotions and our imaginations. Folks are concerned that demolition denies a sense of continuity and access to experiencing cultural constructions from our past. There's a sense that we deserve a right to maintain our connections to the cultural aspects of buildings, despite the fact that they're owned as real estate, or they're owned by the government, or the buildings maybe don't even function anymore. That cultural aspect still remains. And when they disappear, it feels like that we're losing a piece of ourselves.
Yeah, a part of us has died.
Or we're losing a piece of our collective memory that we can't access anymore.
And so, as best we can, much of that needs to be preserved, as much of it as possible, for the most practical uses as possible.
What seems sacred and enduring all the time about our place is actually revealed to just be pretty fragile, able to be wiped away and then replaced much, much faster and easier than we'd like. The Tartarian believers latch onto this.
If you're tearing down big swaths of the city, that's a big, big project. A lot of people are going to feel burned. They're going to feel outside the system, and that's going to build resentment, and it's going to curdle, and then it might turn into something kind of weird, like Tartaria.
They exaggerate and distort and dramatize this loss of destruction, tapping into our fear that some hidden power is controlling which parts of history that we're allowed to remember. But in many ways, this is exactly what's happened because of the Columbian Exposition, not to it. That, I think, is the big tragic irony here. The architect behind the Columbian Exposition, Daniel Burnham, he was a fantastic salesman. With this spectacular chunk of pop-up urbanity, Burnham presented a vision of urban beauty that fundamentally reshaped expectations of what cities could become. But Burnham didn't use a real city to show us this dream of his. Instead, he built a theme park. And because ever since people have been fooled into believing the theme park could become real, they saw the installation in the photos like this as a proof of concept. So it became a kind of Pinocchio version of architecture in cities. When the
I mean, he really should have just built the real thing and then we wouldn't have had this problem. Not trying to make everything out of plaster molds.
Wealthy and the politically elite who visited the expo returned home to places like Detroit and Cleveland, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., and of course other parts of Chicago. They sought to bring a piece of Burnham's dream home with them. They wanted their cities to be beautiful, just like the fair. And this became known as the City Beautiful movement.
City Beautiful is a pretty incredible moment in the history of architecture and urbanism because it's sort of the moment where urban planning coalesces as a field.
It was fundamentally an attempt to remake American cities in the image of the exposition by inserting grand boulevards, stately Beaux-Arts structures, plazas, fountains, and parks into our existing cities.
I mean, it sounds like a stellar start already. All the things that would make for a wonderful city. I should very much like to live in a place like that. I think a lot of us would.
That all sounds great, but as you can probably tell, there's a few problems. The first one is pretty obvious. If these existing cities are going to become more beautiful, we need to demolish what's there and make way for these beautiful makeovers. Take the Benjamin Franklin Parkway in Philadelphia, for instance. Today, it looks like this, a majestic boulevard lined with museums and cultural institutions. It's so well organized and the buildings are so grand that it seems like maybe it's always been there. But before it became this, it was a dense urban neighborhood. Over 1,500 homes were cleared, starting in 1907, so that we could have a place for Rocky to run up and to snarl traffic. Now I'm all for big ideas, and I know that ambitious projects come with significant costs to existing communities.
Yeah, break an omelet, you gotta crack a few eggs.
So let's focus just on the design parts of this for a minute. When an area of a city grows over time, most of it's not pre-planned or controlled. There are all sorts of strange little details and things that pop up. And
yeah, that all happened like the old structures probably just popped up kind of random, sporadically, little bits at a time, almost making like a patchwork quilt. Well, finally everything was taken as a whole and said, okay, these patches we've got to demolish, these patches over here, this little bit right here, and then, leave some stuff out on the edges intact.
Things that maybe just don't make all that much sense, but give it a lot of character. And with this, in these pre-1900 cities, developed a sort of human scale that you can see in this part that was eventually removed. But projects like the Franklin Parkway are planned from the top down, and they can never have the kinds of character of what it replaced. It just can't. The moves are too big, and they come all at once. So to compensate, these grand plans dress up the buildings inside of them as a substitute for the character that had developed there organically. Sure,
overcompensating, basically.
These new buildings are well built, and they have all kinds of pretty ornamentation and craftsmanship. But these are being imposed onto this place. And to do that, it had to erase what was there before. The Tartarians believed that buildings like this, and maybe even this exact building, come from a distant and mysterious culture. And in reality, for people in Philadelphia, they do come from another distant culture. But their origins, they're not mysterious at all. In reality, the model that the Columbian Exposition and the City Beautiful makeovers, the model that they are emulating, it comes from France during the Second Empire. In fact, the aesthetic category of beautiful, just as a category of landscapes, comes from there too. You can think about the exquisitely manicured gardens of Versailles and Louis XIV. When it comes to cities, we can look to Paris as the original model from which Daniel Burnham was inspired or copied. You can see some pretty obvious similarities in the axial alignments of monuments and the types of architecture that are here. And while the origins aren't mysterious at all, how they were translated and how they were applied to American cities, I think deserves a hard look. At the time of the Columbian Exposition, Daniel Burnham had actually never been to Europe. So he strategically hired plenty of architects who trained in Paris at a special school called the École des Beaux-Arts. Their training allowed them to make pretty convincing replicas of what you'd find around Paris at the time.
It's smart. There are many instances where you don't want to be the smartest in the room. Instead, surround yourself with people that are smarter than you. If he had never been to Europe, how could he be expected to create something that is architecturally in the European style? Therefore, he goes out and finds people who have been out there, who have toured Europe, who have even lived in Europe. He surrounds himself with these experts, and their contributions help to coalesce a sort of master plan.
The designer of the Benjamin Franklin Parkway in Philadelphia, for instance, trained there, and it's where Edward Bennett went to school. Bennett was the co-author of the 1909 plan for Chicago with none other than Daniel Burnham himself. That 1909 plan, which you might have seen pictures of from before, is the City Beautiful movement's attempt to turn Chicago into what was called the Paris of the Prairie. The comparison between the two cities is pretty clear.
You're making the city much more legible, kind of more sequential, more readable.
So my question is, why are Americans so eager to make their cities more like Paris? Sure, it's a beautiful city, but all the parts that we're trying to copy were maliciously carved into the city by a power-hungry emperor trying to show off his power. Napoleon III ordered engineer George Haussmann to replan the city to make it impossible for citizens to take it back from the emperor. Unlike Americans who were sold that this beauty would enrich everyone's lives, the Parisian beauty was imposed on the city as a weapon to manage and control the people of it. The wide boulevards made it harder for rebels to erect barricades and easier for troops to move through, making military rule of the city possible. Then the emperor lined those...
But, not impossible. I would disagree with him on that.
Boulevards with endless rows of Beaux-Arts style or Second Empire style buildings. Not only did this provide visual order to the chaotic city, it brought people in line too, like literally. And that's the dream that we were sold by Daniel Burnham. Critics of the City Beautiful movement called it an architectural cult.
The adoption of City Beautiful was a pretty, obvious ploy to instill obedience and discipline in the citizenry.
This theme park convinced us to demolish our...
I mean, is that really so bad, given at the time what Chicago was like? And in fact, some would argue that's what's needed now for the city of Chicago. There's plenty of large urban centers and large cities that they need this sort of gentrification. Because what's there now is a breeding ground for the criminal element.
Our cities to make way for displays of beauty taken from a tyrant. So in the end, the Tartarian believers, they're totally right. Except the buildings that they are worried about losing are the exact ones that actually took their buildings in the first place and are the ones that are trying to control them. They're worried about a powerful entity denying access to history, but the reality is that we've been duped into believing a fake history all along through architecture. So skeptics, they have a point. Our cities are constantly being reshaped, but we should not fall prey to equating architectural style with permanence or authenticity. There's a real opportunity here to appreciate and preserve our architectural heritage, and I'm excited that people are getting excited about it. But don't be fooled into thinking that a building with columns and gilded domes are timeless. It might just be a cheap plaster knockoff.
But the design itself is timeless. I think that's the point. I mean, he is correct. The way they were constructed, yes, they are basically cheap knockoffs. But those sorts of motifs, those sorts of elements, those can be incorporated into real buildings, into authentic new structures. And the landscape, the community, and the people will be richer for it. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. Subscribe to the channel and click the bell icon so you never miss an update. If you have any thoughts, questions, or ideas for future videos, drop them in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. You can also follow me on Twitter @LordRexworth for more updates and behind-the-scenes content. And if you want to support the channel, check out my Ko-fi or Throne pages. Links are in the description. Finally, be sure to visit LordRexworth.com and follow me across all platforms. That's LordRexworth.com. Until next time, I wish you all the best, and God bless.